Thank you for being here. It is my pleasure to speak a few words to those who do not yet know Bikash, the speaker of this year's Chautari Foundation lecture. The format of the program is very simple. What I do is introduce him with some words, and then he will present the lecture, and then we'll have 1 hour, more or less 1 hour long open floor discussion. Bikash attended St. Xavier's School, Godavari and Yala, and finished his O-level exams in 1975. He was judged the best boy of his graduating class by the school. In 1979, he went to study at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT in Cambridge, from where he obtained a SP in electrical engineering in 1983. After working for 2 years in the Cambridge-Boston area, he returned to Nepal in 1985. He worked for development and consulting services in Butwal for 4 years before switching to work for the Intermediate Technology Development Group, ITDG, now called Practical Action, in Kathmandu. In those 10 years of work, focused mostly on Nepal, he worked intensively in the field of microhydro development and related appropriate technologies for Nepal. In the early and mid-1990s, along with several other colleagues, as part of the Alliance for Energy, he successfully argued why making Arun III in the World Bank supported mode with various conditionalities was a big mistake, and earned the title of an Arun Birodhi from the Nepali press and development technocrats. In 1995, he went to the University of California to study in its Energy and Resource Group and obtained a MS in 1997. Thereafter, he worked for Windrock International in its Washington, D.C. office and returned to Nepal in 1998 to work in the Nepal office of the same organization. He promoted alternative, renewable, and clean energy programs for several years before expanding his scope of work to other parts of South Asia, in particular Pakistan and Afghanistan, and Africa in Kenya and Uganda. He is currently the innovation lead for clean energy at Windrock International's Washington, D.C. office. His work experience thus encompasses 25 years in policy review, design and implementation of a range of clean, renewable energy projects in Asia, Africa and Latin America. During the same period, he has authored several articles and reports in the fields of his work. For instance, he wrote Local Benefits from Hydro Development, which was published in the journal Studies in Nepali History and Society, Sinhas, Volume 1, Number 2 in 1996. For several years now, he has been co-writing a textbook on hydropower and is now involved in co-writing an account of the Post-Arun III hydropower project trajectories in Nepal, the subject of his talk today. Allow me to digress a little here. In the spring of 1993-94, a young idealist mechanical engineer had just returned to Nepal from India. He had literally memorized the book Small is Beautiful, line by line, and was adamant to work at the ITDG and nowhere else. Luckily, Bhola Shresthaji, an engineer working at the ITDG, believed the young man and took him in. Bholaji was of course unaware of the difficulties of putting trusts on dream-smitten adolescents. The meetings regarding Project Arun III were also being held in the ITDG office during the period, and the young engineer sometimes stood peripherally by the intense discussions among people like Deepak Gyawali-ji, who is here, Rajendra Dahalji, who is here, Gopal Shivakotti-ji, and Bikash-ji. Unexposed to the open discussion culture in his Nepali upbringing, the young man found it extremely exciting that the group amicably set aside issues of passionate differences and acted only on consensus. That method worked rather effectively when compared, for instance, to today's chaotic humdrum of political consciousness. It is a bit of a coincidence that the same young engineer, now a bit of a graying historian of technology, is having the privilege of requesting Bikash-ji for the lecture. Like all great experiments in history, the origins of Martin Chautari are hazy and subject to distinct recollections. At Chautari, we often joke that the organization was founded 3 times. First in 1991, when Bikash-ji, the late Martin Houghton, and several others founded a discussion group called Development Philosophy Development Group, which later became the fortnightly Tuesday discussion series, affectionately also called Mangalbares by its participants. For most of the next 2-3 years, these discussions were held in his ITDC office in Kamalati. Martin, who was then a graduate student at Oxford, was tragically killed in an aircraft accident in 1992, and when his parents decided to use the money collected by his friends and family in Norway and Oxford to support the discussion series in Kathmandu, they and Bikash-ji decided to rent a building in the Thapthari area. That was done in the spring of 1995, and the building where the discussions were now held was called Martin Chautari, and some people recollect it being called so much before that. MC's second founding, as it were. Finally, when MC, or Chautari, was eventually registered as a separate NGO in November 2002, Bikash-ji was one of the 7 signatory founders. Hence, he has the unique distinction of being there in all 3 founding moments of Martin Chautari. As Chautari's chair, I am also happy to share that Chautari has been carrying on the same principal legacy of public discussion for the last 23 years. I hope that today's open discussion after the lecture will prove no exception to that tradition. Thanks for bearing me with this long. Allow me now to request Bikash-ji to deliver the 2015 annual Chautari lecture. Thank you all.
Thank you, Yogesh-ji. I don't know if I need a mic or if I can be heard in the back. I know this room has good acoustics. Let me try without the mic, and if I do need the mic, then I will get to it. So, my distinct pleasure to be providing this annual lecture of Chautari. I think Yogesh-ji has already given the background on.
Please use mic.
Yeah? Okay. So already discussed a little bit the intersections between Arun III's debate and Martin Chautari. Many of the early discussions took place in that venue. And in the early days of the political changes in Nepal, I think this was one of the first issues taken up in this particular way. And I think, really through discussion alone, without street protests, without a big, political politicization, I think some sort of a movement was launched at that time. Let me go through my presentation. I made a PowerPoint just to keep my thoughts organized. I'll try not to be too dependent on it, but just as an outline. And I'll try and weave the story and the logic behind the arguments around the debates around Arun III, what that meant at that time versus what it means today, what conclusions were reached then versus what happened 20 years in this interim. And I'll try and connect those two eventually by the time I get to the presentation. So the background, essentially, as I mentioned, is Arun III was one of the early outcomes, I think, to my mind, of democratic change, where it was finally possible, it was okay to discuss a major topic like this and bring it up and be hopeful that that discussion would lead to change. Now, 1995 August is when the World Bank finally pulled out of Arun III. It's 20 years. This is the 20th year. Time has gone quickly, but it does give a very interesting time, to look back and take a look at how did the sector develop without Arun III. Many predictions were made at that time about what would happen. Some foretold darkness forever. Others said the alternative would be infinitely brighter. And now we have time, and there's empirical evidence in a certain sense, unusually, because this is hydro, there's megawatts, there's dollars invested, there's numbers of projects. So it's much more rich in data than many of the other debates that started at that time. I do want to make a quick disclaimer. Several institutions were mentioned. The Alliance for Energy was a group that was formed, one of the two main groups that was formed around this debate. Several members from the original alliance are in this room today. Martin Chautari, I mentioned, where many of the discussions took place in those early days. Intermediate Technology Group, where I used to work and where also used to be Martin Chautari's first discussions every Tuesday. Windrock International is where I work today. So the disclaimer basically is I'm not speaking on behalf of any of these groups today. I'm speaking really on my own behalf. But I'm very much indebted to these institutions for having provided that forum at that time. And since I haven't had a chance to check with them on whether they have a position on this, I really cannot speak on their behalf today. So the way I will present this, first of all, I think 20 years ago, I expect more than half the people in this room were, had not finished high school at that time. So I think maybe I should give a little bit of a background in terms of what that debate was, since, what may be obvious to some people is not so obvious to others. I will then go through some of the developments in the hydropower sector since then, and make a link with Arun III, as I see. What the cause and effect, what happened, what resulted, and perhaps discuss some ways forward based on that understanding. So what was the Arun III debate? To make a very clear distinction, something that is confused a lot, the Arun III discussion and debate, as far as the Alliance for Energy was concerned, definitely was against the way Arun III was formulated. And it was the main grievance was that the way development worked, the way donor aid worked, that the options had narrowed down to the point where there was nothing else that could be considered. And a single project had been selected through a least cost generation expansion plan, which was considered Nepal's best project, and yet by the time, since it was the only project running for 8 years by that point already, nothing else could even be studied to that same level of detail. And the project particularly had a major weakness from our perspective, that it was two mega projects back to back, essentially. It first required a 120-kilometer road to be built just to get to the project site. And then the dam itself had to be built, the largest dam in Nepal till that point. So the chances of getting both of these constructed in sequence, in time, within budget, to our mind was close to impossible. Building a 120-kilometer road in Nepal itself is a major task. This was in the eastern Himalayas that had never had a road before. The proposal was made that in order to speed up the road, cement and diesel would be helicoptered in at 7 different points. So the simple thing that came to our mind was Arun III so unique that it had to be built under those extreme artificial conditions? One of the big results of this was this so-called best project for Nepal was going to be expensive at close to $5,400 per kilowatt. The 201 megawatt first phase, so-called Baby Arun. For close to 8 years, no other project could even be considered because the conditionalities of the donors were that NEA should not be distracted with looking at anything else. And as this became the exclusive pursuit, there was no way to check whether something else could be better. So we call this the no option track. We were going into a narrower and narrower set of options for the country, which was looking more and more like this was no way that this was really going to be an asset. We felt, given all the uncertainties of any normal hydro project, the risks were really being stacked one on top of the other to make it completely impractical and unnecessary. The other major complaint was that this was crowding out alternative investments. The paths were blocked, both from within NEA and without NEA. Since nothing else could be considered within NEA, no other project could really be looked at. Any other project even studied was considered competition and therefore a distraction. The private sector was nowhere in sight. That discussion hadn't even started at this point. And not only this, but you will see in the investment plan laid out at that time, after the Arun III was going to be Upper Arun and then Lower Arun. So 80% of future projects were all going to be in a single river valley at one end of the country. So these were all the main arguments. This was not an environmental argument. This was not saying that, and there were environmental concerns. It's just that this was not the main argument that was made by the Alliance for Energy. What it was not was an argument against Arun III as a hydropower project in an absolute sense. Arun III came out in many ways as Nepal's best project. And a fundamental argument was if you take Nepal's best project and can only construct it at $5,400 a kilowatt, is there any room for Nepal to still call hydropower a major asset for the country? So we felt a really good project had been taken, distorted to the point where it really had stopped being an asset already. So it was, we believe now that Arun III remains one of the most attractive hydropower projects, and that's how it should be developed. In a natural way that it maintains those advantages, not in an artificial way, through a selection process that ended up really providing no other choices at that time. So what we put forward at that time was what we called an alternative approach. First of all, the fundamental element of that alternative approach is multiple pathways, just as a way to reduce risk. So we wanted both public and private sector companies to be involved, and thought that the 1 to 50 megawatt range was a much better place to start. And the debate essentially at that time, as far as the World Bank was concerned, ran in this particular way. That they said, well, Nepal's annual need is only 20 megawatts. But as far as a big funding agency is concerned, it takes as long to develop a 20 megawatt project as a 200 megawatt project. And that typical time frame is 10 years. So there's no point in considering anything less than a 200 megawatt project. So the way that argument ran, it resulted in a constant flood and drought syndrome. So you had Kulekhani several years, Marsyangdi several years, Arun. It's this artificial way in which the demand would build up, a large project would be built with foreign aid, And then again, demand would build up, something else would come in. And we felt very much that this was artificial. What really needed to happen was that power should be coming on incrementally. If the yearly demand was 20 megawatts, that could be met with 20 megawatt projects, or two 10 megawatt projects, or 21 megawatt projects. And if they could come on incrementally, and they could come on in different parts of the country, and they could be owned by different owners, we felt this was a much less risky way to go forward. We also felt there was lots of idle money in Nepal that should come into hydropower, and that there had been no attempts to mobilize this money at all. And that because we got into this mess because of complete dependence on donors, that this was a respite from that. And also we believe that the public sector investment really should be there to facilitate private sector investments, not to substitute for that. Whenever the public sector is so active that it stops anybody else investing, that public sector money really can be used in so many other sectors, the social sectors, many other sectors where the private sector cannot invest, schools, health, all of these types of things. And so when a huge public sector investment pushes the private sector out, and then also is not spent in another sector in which the private sector doesn't come, it's a loss at so many different levels. Fundamentally, we believe that hydropower development really needed to be built on a foundation of Nepali developers, Nepali construction companies, Nepali engineering professionals, and Nepali investment. If the price was to come down to anything reasonable in the range of $2,000 a kilowatt instead of the $5,000 that Arun had got up to. And this was the only way that the aspirations that Nepalis had to get inexpensive, affordable energy could ever be realized. And, if a large project like Arun were to be built, it had to be clear how it wasn't standing in the way of other projects being built. I mean, for us, this was the worst thing, where a single large project stood in the way, was the gorilla in front of the queue, wouldn't let anybody else through, and then became unmanageable because of bureaucracy and just the way that these things were being developed. So the very interesting thing now, and I think I feel so fortunate because so few people get a chance to look back when you have a movement of this kind to say, what really happened? All these things you guys predicted, that was all great theory, but what happened in practice? How did this all work out? And, as you might expect, the results are mixed. It didn't go 100% the way we predicted. In some places, it went slower. Surprisingly, in some areas, it went faster. So let me just sketch out what I believe did happen. So first of all, there is debilitating load shedding. And so a lot of people still say, well, if Arun had come, maybe we wouldn't have had this load shedding. And that's an important question that people like me have to respond to. But what that belies, what that is hiding, is that there has been vigorous investment in hydropower within this interim. It didn't all start immediately, but over time that momentum has built up. And I'd like to make a case that although it's hard for people to believe that are living with 10 hours, 12 hours of load shedding, that load shedding is indeed in sight. And the momentum is building to the point where I believe in 18 months after the upper Tamakoshi comes in, we will finally see a major change on that front. So, and this is the evidence. I mean, there are now 42 operating projects at 716 megawatts, but 84 projects with generation licenses of 2,000 megawatts have been given out, and 43 are under construction, and survey licenses, 87, some larger projects with up to close to 6,000 megawatts. So, I mean, this is typically in any growing market, what you see happening is you have the stock of existing projects is superseded by the number of ongoing construction, is further superseded by the, it's a pyramid with a lot more projects feeding into that. I mean, most countries that have a vigorous growth in their power sector, this is sort of a natural progression. Compare this to what I outlined earlier, where you had the single stick approach, where Marsengdi built on top of Kulekhani, built on top of, each project one after the other, not with any kind of base below that. And Arun was supposed to sit on top of that. So many people say, well, why is load shedding not ending? I mean, you have all of this. Are these projects really being built? From what I can tell, I think in 2013 we had about 25 megawatts added to the grid. 2014 it was less. So there's a gap at the moment. I think we're about $200 million is being invested every year in hydropower now, which is about the rate at which we need investments to generate 100 megawatts each year. But there's a lag between those investments going in and when those actually come out in terms of megawatts. And it's in 18 months when that will finally catch up. Otherwise, right now, I mean, if the demand is growing at about 100 megawatts a year, and if the highest addition has been 30 megawatts, clearly people are not going to see a reduction in load shedding. And that's what's been happening. So it really requires one significant large project like Upper Tamakoshi to come in and clearly make a difference for it finally to register. But I'll make my case in terms of where that momentum is coming from. One of the things I also want to show is how the actual construction of hydropower projects changed dramatically from what the picture was in 1995. Several slides later, I have a picture of what NEA's investment plan was. This is what actually happened. So if you look at the way projects actually developed, 2014, 13, 12, 11, 9, 10, all the way down, pretty much everything is a project built with Nepali rupees, the biggest of which was Chilime, and all the other projects, an average of about 7 megawatts. So the portfolio at this point in terms of numbers is clearly dominated by small projects, much in the way that I think as the Alliance we had predicted would happen if you open this sector up to local developers. The international private sector did come in, but that ended up being 2 projects, the Kimti and Bodikoshi, and didn't expand beyond that. NEA's contribution of its own projects has also been relatively modest. You'll see I put Chilime as Nepali private rather than NEA. I mean, it would go somewhere in between, I guess, in terms of... I'm putting this mainly in terms of Nepali private as in the source of money that has come in for these investments. So the summary basically is you have, since 2000, NEA 235 megawatts, 4 projects, international private 105, 2 projects, and the Nepali private 122 megawatts, 24 numbers. So it's quite clear which way the trend in terms of investments has shifted in Nepal. And the remarkable thing is how much Nepali rupees have actually been invested in this sector in these years. If you think back to 1995, when the idea that Nepali rupees actually had a role in terms of producing megawatts was really in nobody's mind. This was very clearly NEA's turf. This was a public sector territory, and there was really no role for anybody else to be investing. It was the government's money, it was the donors' money, and that's how it would be. So it is quite remarkable that 122 megawatts roughly has mobilized about 20 billion rupees. $200 million has already been mobilized in this sector. Even more remarkable, $1.5 billion is being mobilized for the 1,200 megawatts of projects under construction right now. Not all of this is in hand. Some of it is still being mobilized as these projects go through construction. But this is a huge amount of money. And to keep in mind that in these 20 years, one of the big surprises has been that the donor money never really rebounded. I mean, we had thought that, the money that didn't go into Arun would be available to other projects. Partly it happened. Some of the money went to Middle Marsangdi. But really, for all intents and purposes, most of the money just didn't materialize. So Nepal has really been this development where load shedding is in sight has really happened practically all with Nepali rupees. And this would have been almost impossible to predict 20 years ago. It was conjecture, and I'll make an argument for why I think this has happened. I'm looking back at the Alliance for Energy papers. We had predicted at that time that $200 million would be mobilized from the local market, and the World Bank would put in 400 million, and that 600 million would be needed to get us to this point. In reality, that's not what happened at all. 200 million has already been mobilized, but that public sector investment really, the donor investment really didn't come through. And there are several reasons for that. So it's very fortunate for Nepal that, somebody did step into that vacuum, and it ended up being the huge liquidity that showed up in the market here. Eventually, with its roots in remittances and sources of money that took everybody by surprise. So, roughly 20 to 30 billion rupees has now been coming into this sector now for the last 4 to 5 years. And this is the level that is needed to produce 100 megawatts a year. So we are very much at replacement level, pretty much all with Nepali rupees. But the results are not showing because of that lag, which I think we're about to catch up, as I said, in about 18 months. So this already here, I think, is the good news. It's a remarkable story. And I think has not been really talked about enough. And it's just that people, I think, have a hard time visualizing that load shedding is really that close to coming to an end when they are not seeing it in their everyday lives. And it's because we haven't had that one single project step in and really, make this very clear. So who are these investors? Who has been investing in Nepal's power sector? I make the point in the introductory statement that, this vigorous hydro development has really been done by non-conventional investors and developers. So take a look at the investors in 1995, take a look at the investors today, and I think none of us would have been able to predict at that time exactly who this would be. Nepal Electricity Authority and subsidiary companies. And there's a remarkable story here that even within NEA, the folks that really believe that the Nepali engineers within NEA should design and build their own hydro projects, who were a discouraged and non-credible group within NEA at that time, when the dominance was by the people close to management were those who went after the more flashy, glamorous, donor-funded projects. That group that had such a low profile really rose in a dramatic way within NEA. The Nepali private sector investors, I will have more details. Some NRN investors, I think, have also come to the front. Institutional investors, the Employees Provident Fund, remarkably, this is in the Alliance for Energy papers. Everybody saw this as a big source of money, and that has happened. The Citizen Investment Trust, another pension fund, again very active. Nepal Telecom, that was a surprise. I don't think anybody saw Nepal Telecom investing in the hydropower sector. The insurance company Rashtriya Bima Samsthan. Most commercial banks at this point, including the Clean Energy Development Bank, which was a dedicated bank to hydro, and most commercial banks have invested in hydro at this point. And finally, we're at this point getting also dedicated companies like the public company, hydroelectricity investment and development company, which has come in precisely to, invest in hydropower. Several companies, some high profile, have gone to the public and raised money through that. And there are some big ones coming up. The folks that have done the most in this area are NEA subsidiary companies. 20 years ago, nobody in NEA would have believed that they would have the confidence to go to the public and raise money and build hydropower projects. And this has happened. And I'll make the case for why it took pushing Arun off the table for that confidence to come in. So Chilime, the Upper Tamakoshi, these are all subsidiary companies of NEA. These companies have gone, but several other companies as well. Arun Valley, National Hydropower, Butol Power Company, Sanima, they have all gone to the public. And here there's plenty of room for expansion. I think this hasn't been done in an organized way. I think these are still ad hoc and lots of room to expand this. So who are the developers? So if you look at Chilime Hydropower Company was, in 1995, almost immediately after Arun III was cancelled, the Chilime project got incorporated and now has 3 siblings, sister companies, and between them, remarkably, these are companies all have majority shares from NEA. Between them, these companies now have, or at least are developing a portfolio practically as much as what NEA had in 1995, about 250 megawatts. This is a remarkable development within the sector. Butol Power Company, which was privatized several years ago, is another major company. I think it didn't grow to the extent that people had hoped, or as some of the younger companies grew, but still a very important player. Sanima Hydropower Limited, this is one of the companies with significant NRN, non-resident Nepali investment. Hydro Solutions, Arun Valley, several of the people are here in the audience. These are all companies, and what I wanted to point out here is not that these companies have built these very large projects, but the way their ambitions have increased. Several of these companies started with 2 megawatt projects, 3 megawatt projects. Today they're building 20 megawatt projects, and they have gone ahead and studied projects which are much bigger than what they are likely to be able to construct alone. But they have gone out and feel confident to bring in international partners to work with them to develop these large projects. And to my mind, that's organic growth. That's how it should be, rather than sort of single options of projects without really some credibility to support them. So after the cancellation of Arun III, 3 fronts opened, 2 of them almost simultaneously, one a few years later. So the international private sector projects had been, hadn't had their power purchase agreement signed, and all of a sudden, once Arun got pushed off the table, those were signed in a hurry. So Kimti, Bodekoshi, these were signed. Chilime became incorporated, as I mentioned, in 1995. That's the company owned 51% by NEA. It took 3 more years before the Minister Saila Chautari issued the standard, asked NEA to issue the standard PPA for projects below 10 megawatts. In terms of donor resources, KfW invested in Middle Marsangdi. The World Bank put forward the Power Development Fund, which really went nowhere. That investment did not move till today. I think USAID and GTZ probably were the only 2 that provided technical support to, in some ways, support the alternatives that the Alliance had put forward, the local developers, the small developers. And belatedly, we have now investments from KfW, Norwegian, NORAD, ADB, for transmission infrastructure. And the two things surprising to me about the donor resources is, first of all, it didn't go into supporting more hydropower generation as had been expected. But it also didn't go into making the complementary infrastructure investments, like transmission lines, like the larger reservoir types of projects which the private sector would not do. So that just became a gap. And it was remarkably lucky for Nepal that there was enough liquidity in the market that something was able to step in its place. And this didn't end up being, indeed, many decades of darkness. So one of the questions that comes a lot is, okay, so you're showing this picture of a big active sector that came there. Wouldn't it have been wonderful if we could have had both? What if we had all these private sector developers and we had Arun? So we wouldn't have load shedding and we would have had a vibrant, alternative. Why could we not have both? Why one or the other? And I think this is one of these things which is impossible to take both trajectories. So one always, you have to sort of predict what would have happened if we had gone the other way. So I'll make some arguments in terms of why I think we couldn't have had both. And we can discuss during the question and answer session. First of all, let me present to you my Exhibit A, which is NEA's Investment Plan 1994-2007. Think back to that picture I showed of what actually happened in terms of investments and see if you see any similarity between those two. So Jimbrook happened, Trishuli upgrade happened, Khimti happened, Kaligandaki happened. But after that, the picture is completely different, right? So what was supposed to happen based on the 1994-2007 was Arun III, the baby Arun, which was cancelled in 2000, was supposed to come online in 2002. Second phase of that, 2006. Upper Arun 2009, and then followed by Lower Arun after that. So this is what the plan was. So it clearly shows the role for international private sector, which was the Khimti and then Botekoshi got added, but really no role for Nepali private and public sector companies. None of the Chilime, none of the other small private companies. So it's very clear it was not envisioned. Could it still have happened? Could somebody have had, the brilliance to see that, it made a lot of sense to make the sector more plural? Who knows? But at that time, it certainly wasn't in the books. There was no plan for that to happen. And so I have to conclude that it was only because it got interrupted on the Arun III that a different path was taken, a different result ensued. The second major reason was that there was a very clear narrowing of options as a precondition to doing Arun. So there were 40 conditionalities which the donor community had put on NEA and the government of Nepal in order to finance a $1 billion project, in a country that had an annual budget of about $1 billion. So the argument was, this is a major undertaking. Here's all the things you have to do to demonstrate yourselves worthy of getting financing for a project like this. And to my mind, the most problematic one was that outside of that investment plan, which was in that MOU, NEA could not even study a hydropower project above 10 megawatts without donor approval. And from the side of the donors, this seemed logical. They said, well, you guys have limited management capacity. We don't want you getting distracted in 5 different directions. But from a risk perspective, this is about the worst thing you can do. Straitjacket somebody and then say you are not allowed to look left, right, just have to walk this way. And if that falls off a cliff, well, so be it. So it's very clear that if you don't study a project, there's no chance of building it. With hydro, there's the typical delay of several years because of the time it takes to study and do EIAs, etc. So to my mind, this narrowing of options very clearly meant that if we had taken Arun, we couldn't have done anything else. And narrowing of options is not unique to hydro. We can look again at another sector where the same thing is applied. And it seems to apply particularly to all sectors where only one option is kept open, and generally because of donor requirements. And so this is something that happens in pretty much all poor developing countries, which are highly dependent on donors for any capital-intensive project, where the donors require you to do only one thing, professionally designed, and yet it's oftentimes a very risky step forward. It oftentimes gets countries into big trouble. And this has happened to the Melamchi water supply project in Nepal, which again is another big infrastructure project. The end is not in sight. Several options, we've stopped looking for those. No other options can really be developed at this particular point. And yet, people really don't have the choice to, at this point, do anything but wait. It's a sense of helplessness that has pervaded, Kathmandu for now, I think as long as anybody can remember. Because you get to a certain point where only that is allowed, all other options have been stopped early on, and that doesn't go anywhere. What do you do? So, a very real concern is, could Arun III have taken the same path? Where you take on a huge project like this, nothing else can be looked at, no other option can be even investigated, and you have nowhere else to go once you're down that path. The other very clear point is that NEA continues to be very unwelcoming of IPPs. There are several developers in this room, everybody can vouch for this. Even without Arun, NEA, every IPP is like pulling teeth. Every PPA is like pulling teeth. And so it's very clear, if NEA itself had Arun III coming, had its own project coming, there would be zero incentive for NEA to say, I will sign an IPP with you. I think most likely they would say, why should I sign an IPP with you when my own power plant is coming 5 years, 6 years down the line? Whether that came in 5 or 6 years is something completely different. But the fact is, when PPAs are not signed, those projects wouldn't even start. And so it's, if it is so difficult to get PPAs out of NEA without Arun, I am 100% confident that it'd be impossible with Arun. So it's one more reason why I think it'd be impossible to act that path. And for me, it's inevitable that given the unstable political climate, the lack of governance, the unsettling of everything around, that a project like this could actually be done, as I mentioned, 2 mega projects back to back. The 120-kilometer road would have to be completed before the dam construction could even start. The question we asked the World Bank at that time repeatedly was, there's 6,000 rivers in Nepal, there's hundreds of projects, why are we picking the one project that requires a 120-kilometer road before we can start construction of that dam? Why is it that Arun has to be done today? Why can that not be done later once that road is in place and that risk is much reduced? And the answer each time was this is the project that came out of the least cost generation plan, it's the one we have studied, it's the one the donors are behind, therefore we do this or nothing else. And it's that particular attitude and that straitjacket, I think, which we avoided. I think, which could have gotten into a quagmire that we would all have not been able to get out of at this time. I'm predicting, given what happened to Madhya Marchandi, what's happening to Melamchi today, that the delays and cost overruns on Arun would be increased by a factor of 5. First of all, this project would have been 3 times as big as Madhya Marchandi. And second of all, it wasn't close to a road like Madhya Marchandi was. So straightforward projects in accessible areas were delayed, had cost overruns. Arun, which had all these things multiplied, I cannot imagine how this would be, you know, miraculously on time and within budget. So my conclusion is, I have two simple conclusions. One is that Nepal is in a much better position for construction of Arun III today than 20 years ago. As I mentioned, the argument has never been that Arun III should never be constructed. Why do I say this? Well, the fundamental one, what I've been saying for the last 45 minutes is, you don't want to get into the position of having only one option. And today, because of all the other developments that have happened, Arun is one of many projects. It has, the risks surrounding any project are not going to be reduced over time. But that risk is going to be mitigated by the fact that there are several avenues that are happening. Secondly, even that money is not really being looked at from public resources. And so it doesn't block anything else. It's somebody else's risk. That risk gets divided between different institutions. The road is largely completed. There was a very strong argument at that time to say that the poor people in the Arun Valley would have at least gotten a road if that Arun III project had gone through. Why did you guys stop that? And the argument I want to make right now is, in these 20 years, a huge number of districts now have a road. Mustang has a road. You know, you've got a road going to Jumla. You've got roads pretty much everywhere at this point. So it's a natural progress where every district, all the remote districts, remaining districts needed roads. So now that the road is there, I mean, it's a much more natural way to get to Arun III. And that's huge. Here's maybe perhaps the most dramatic evidence. The cost of the new developer is now $1 billion, but now for a 4.5 times bigger project. What was $1 billion for a 201 megawatt project is now $1 billion for a 900 megawatt project. And so indeed, Arun remains fundamentally a sound project, if done the right way, but if done in a way which is artificial, pushed by a faulty planning process, we could have been saddled with taking one of our best projects and turning it into something 4 times more expensive than it needed to. Local people are much aware of their rights and their share of the benefits, their rightful share of benefits. So I think, you know, this is the other issue. I mean, there's been so much discussion in these 20 years about what share of the royalty or shares of the company local people should get. It's not just a question of mitigation. I mean, I think we've gone one step further, and I think this is another benefit which is likely to come from the project in terms of local areas. So this is one set of conclusions. The second conclusion is that the alternative approach, to my mind, is well on its way to being realized. It's a much more pluralistic sector than we had in 1995. There didn't happen the complementary public sector investments in time, although those are belatedly catching up. And by the complementary public sector investment, I mean, if the private sector is doing all these run-of-river projects, in a rational planning system, the public sector should really do the reservoirs and the multi-purpose projects, which the private cannot do. The public sector should do the transmission lines, and those didn't happen. So the alternative was not really supported in a planned way by anybody. It just has happened, several one-offs, all combined to form a sector. Donor funding was slow to support the alternative sector, but remarkably remittance kicked in and surprised everybody and saved the day for not just the hydro sector, but the country as a whole. Despite the conflict, despite everything, I think everybody recognizes that it's the remittance that's keeping the country afloat. And so this is where we are today. Thank you.
Thank you, Bikash. The floor is open for discussion, and it could be in English as well as in Nepali.
Thank you for a very interesting, insightful talk. It should work. Thank you, Bikash, for a very insightful talk. I was also recalling the time of the jubilation when Arun was pulled off with all the activism that went on at that time. But when we were suddenly hit with the load shedding, I wondered to myself, like, well, with all the activism that had gone on, had we successfully managed to pull off the Arun, how did the calculation went wrong with the activists? That they did not think about that the time period it will take for building another electricity project, and that suddenly, and wouldn't even be activating NEA to take up the other project. So suddenly, we are now reflecting after 25 years, Mr. Arun was pulled off in about 20 some. So what went with the activists, all who were involved in that? How did their calculation went wrong in not pushing the other alternatives that we have taken? I would also wonder that now we can lavish on the fact that remittance is now bearing the cost of it. The long-term cost of the remittance could be far, far too higher than that Arun, or far too many Aruns. So maybe that also could have been accounted, because this is one side of the story. The other side of the story would have been, what have you lost not having, with like 18 hours of load shedding, the energy of all the entire population of Nepal? Maybe that calculation also could have been also put into perspective. And if you see, if you have gained more, certainly that we have gone into the, incremental or a small project, but maybe that perspective can also be added into this project presentation. Thank you.
Address some of these points in the sense that, first of all, you take a sector that is 100% donor dependent. There's only so much activists can do in terms of mobilizing those investments from a 100% donor dependent sector to alternative funding. And so I made the point that the month after Arun was pulled out, we in the Alliance wrote a white paper to suggest how the resources that had been allocated to Arun should be used in terms of developing a hydropower fund to help the sector rather than a single project, that several competitive projects should be able to compete for those types of funds. But I think what happened was, given the government of Nepal's disarray at that time, there wasn't really a take-up, and neither was it from the donor side. So fundamentally that, I think, was the problem. And this is what is responsible for having the load shedding extending so long. So, there is I do believe that activists have a responsibility when they're against something to forcefully put what should come in its place. At the same time, there's a limit to the resources activists can bring to bear. Activists are not the World Bank. The World Bank will not be activists. So they're different animals, and each works in their space. The other issue about the cost of the 18-hour load shedding, I've been trying to make a point that I believe very strongly Arun would not come online even till today, in much the same way Melanchi hasn't come on. And so it is not a comparison between with power, without power. It is the comparison between without power and no hope of power, or without power and hope, or a way to get the power. That is the comparison. So one has to compare like with like in terms of, as I said, if I thought that there was a chance that both of those could be coming on concurrently, I mean, that would have been ideal. But this is like so many debates in Nepal. Could we have had panchayat and democracy simultaneously? That would have been wonderful, but somehow it doesn't seem to work like that, It seems one has to be pushed off before another one can take its place. And it seems, suboptimal. It seems a lot of wasted energy, lots of wasted resources. And yet, this is the political economy of bureaucracies, that when somebody has a seat, they are not prepared to leave it. for something that could be better without pressure, without something else pushing them off that chair. Nothing else can come in its place. So these are one of the things that we learn, I think, where the lessons can transfer to other sectors as well. It's maybe, I mean, there are political scientists here who understand this phenomenon better, but in the simple way I understand it, this is what I'm saying. If it was indeed possible to get rid of that load shedding and have a pathway to a pluralistic hydropower future, that would have been the best. This is a second best, or maybe lower, but I think probably in terms of achievability, this is probably what could have been achieved in that time.
Thank you, Dr. Bikash Pandey, for enlightening us in a very impressive way. The track to Nepal Pluralistic Hydropower development post-Arun. You covered the pre-area and post-Arun project area. I do have two questions in this connection. One, you rightly said when NEA made a deal with IPP regarding Khimti and other private projects, the deal was $1, and that, in fact, as reported in local media, it has been a big burden to the NEA. That is one. Now in future, how could we avoid that particular situation? That is my question, one. The second one, maybe you are well familiar. We already have two important things, as already happened. One is the PTA with India, and PDA on Upper Kandali, and also the Arun III is in the process with India. So that probably might have changed the entire scenario, you see, particularly of the track 2, you see. Would you probably respond to that particular situation? We are entirely different. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I mean, the question about Khimti and Botikosi, I think, is on a lot of people's minds. In a sense, to my mind, these were the pluralistic approach had some international private sector, had some local private sector. If we didn't have the local private sector, the Chilime and the local developers come up with this momentum, that could have still been a better option than not having any power coming online. However, I mean, I think it's very clear the way the sector has developed. Once the local private sector came in, NEA had the option to sign a PPA in rupees. No more dollar PPAs have been signed. I mean, many of these experiments for Nepal have been expensive. 100% donor dependency is very expensive for Nepal. I think we've had a very long time when we could have had a dynamic hydropower sector and we didn't. Our experience with some international private sector companies has had costs as well. I mean, ideally, you want to be able to learn from these things commensurate with the cost that one has paid. So that cost has been paid. I think within that time, those two projects fulfilled the role. They provided power when there wasn't any other way to get it. In the meantime, other better options have come. And if, you know, PPAs are signed in future, either they will not be in dollars, or they will not have such an escalation clause, or they will be, you know, done in a more competitive way. One of the reasons I like the fact that, you know, we are not stuck on just one option or the other option is that those options will themselves compete against each other, and the best will come out, and we as consumers have the opportunity to choose between them. So at different points in Nepal's hydropower development, I think there have been costs, and there will continue to be costs. But if we have multiple options, I think that costs will be minimized. It will never be zero, but it will be minimized. On the question of the PDAs, my argument is that when we have different ways of getting power in Nepal, those PDAs are less problematic. I mean, there are other challenges with those PDAs. I'm not saying those are immediately going to happen. There are local issues. There are issues about what Nepal gets from those types of projects. There's a whole bunch of issues that are out there. But as long as they are one of many options, I find that is a more secure alternative for Nepal. If these things, I mean, I think for so many years, for 30 years, 40 years, we spent pinning all our hopes on one Karnali or one Arun III or one this project or that project, and that really didn't get us anywhere. I think Nepal has an extremely poor bargaining position when we are looking at a single project to get us out of these problems. The broader that is, the more choices there are, and especially the more it is ingrained into the Nepali capabilities, I think the better anchored we are in order to choose between the better options. Thank you.
As a way of introduction, my name is Arun, not III. Substitute that with S, Arun III. And I remember a piece of history. I was in the USA, and I hosted a conference, ANA's conference, where Bikash Pandey was there, and a bunch of Nepali politicos were there, activist Gopal Sivakuti was there. So very fierce, strong argument, why should we kill Arun III? 22 years have passed. My question is very, very similar to the very first question. 22 years of load shedding. Kathmandu, a beautiful, modest climate as compared to Denver, Colorado, Boston, Massachusetts, and feels significantly colder just because lack of energy. Hillary Clinton, you know, after visiting Africa, she said electricity should become like a fundamental right, and we laughed. She has not been to Nepal, obviously. I mean, losing, 22 years, 25 years, that's a lifetime. Think of a child, think of a young man, think of the productivity, think of the GDP. What happens in developed world in 22 years? That's a big chunk of history lost, okay? And we still cannot write a constitution. This is getting sort of too long and probably deviating. I think the cost of losing 22 years is enormous. I think I want to sensitize that to Nepalis who are here. It is an enormous cost. Much could have happened. I mean, why couldn't we, I went to Khimti. Actually, by the way, I was in the USA for 40 years, came back 2.5 years ago, and enjoying every single day in my home country, my birth country. I visited Khimti. I saw the success story done by Norwegians. I drove in the road, a well-engineered road built by Japanese. And Japanese can do it, Chinese contractors can do it, everybody else can do it.
Can you just pinpoint the question so others will have?
I'm going to pinpoint basically, this is a tremendously a lost opportunity. My question is, I know there is not really a clear answer. Why could not something else be done? That is the question.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to repeat my presentation again, but this is the main point. If indeed it was 100% clear that we could avoid load shedding and also have a way to avoid future load sheddings, that clearly would be the best option. But you look at Melamchi, water is more dear than electricity. And it's close to Kathmandu, centers of power, and yet somehow that 26-kilometer tunnel seems to be evading us constantly. There are serious institutional problems in Nepal. We're going through change. And it's just a serious mistake to put all our hopes in a single program which is so difficult to complete, and assume that magically if we had put our trust in that, that could have happened. I think that would have taken us to the same hopelessness that we have around water right now. I mean, I would have liked to have seen some way in which we could go back certain point on the Melamchi debate as well and say, if only we had taken these other steps, we could have had plan B, we could have had track 2, we could have had a different option. We don't. And it is really to avoid that same sense of hopelessness also in the electricity sector. And, you know, if I honestly believed that, you know, Arun would have come exactly on time and the alternative was going to be all this late, I mean, I would be here sitting here apologizing to you, saying we made a big mistake here. I don't feel any closer, any confidence that somehow Arun would be different from Melamchi, Arun would be different from Madhya Sangdi. I don't see any real reason for that, especially when that particular project, as I mentioned, had 2 mega projects back to back. You're an engineer, you understand probability. They multiply. The probabilities multiply. If the probability of getting one thing right is 10% and getting the second thing right is another 10%, the total probability is 1%. It's not 20%. So that's the problem with I think, Arun, and that's why I think that was still the best decision.
Can you tell us, you've told us how this alternative strategy has built up the local supply industry. Can you comment on how this route has affected the demand for electricity as regards between domestic consumption use and industrial use within the country? In other words, have there been spillover effects as regards the pattern of industrial development and use of electricity?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a great question, and I think the answer is inadequately on both counts. Let me answer the second question first. One of the things I was looking at for that long list of projects, between the hydro projects that are now constructed, the ones that are under construction, and the ones that have been surveyed, the total number of districts that are now covered with either a constructed project or one under construction is about 38, I believe. So one of the key things that has happened is, by having these many small projects in all sorts of districts, there are developers in this room that have recently visited districts they knew about but had never visited because they're out there looking for hydropower sites at this time. A district that has both a road and a hydropower plant, to my mind, is in a significant better situation to get to any kind of industrial base than a district without either one of those, or without one or not the other. And one of the advantages of having a distributed hydro approach, the alternative approach, has been that the number of districts that now either already have or are about to get both a road and a hydropower plant, is significant. And I think this is going to be a backbone for tourism or whatever it is those districts have to offer in terms of employment, in terms of a basis for economic development. A few projects, especially with that investment plan, with the 80% of projects all being in the Arun Valley, I think would clearly not have provided that for, Raswa and Darling and, Mustang and Magdi and all of these districts which today have a hydro project there. On the second question, on the first question of the equipment and the materials that could be produced here, it's been slow, and as I mentioned, the investments have not been aligned. I think there could have been significant amount of work done to support the upstream industries that produce turbines, penstock pipes, gates, even the civil engineering companies that are involved. I think there could be a lot more that could be done in that to have made this a more optimal solution. I know engineers do now have many employment options. Salaries have been going up. Many companies have trouble attracting enough engineers. So clearly many more people are employed in this sector. But the full range of benefits that could have come from a upstream sector that provides the construction materials, the engineering know-how, all the equipment that could be made here, I think that has not been as much as it could, but clearly more than the conventional approach. Thanks.
Thanks, Bikash. My name is Sandeep Giri. I work for a solar company called Power. And speaking of pluralistic development, I'm just curious what happens when you take that concept beyond this hydropower. A significant chunk of the country, our population, is still outside the axis of the transmission lines. And any development in hydropower will first benefit those who are connected by transmission lines. So to those of us who have chosen to venture beyond hydro, maybe we're crazy to go into solar and things like that. I'm just kind of curious of your sort of perspective on that, how technologies like solar, wind, etc., biogas, etc., can contribute into this pluralistic approach of power development.
Thank you, Sandeepji. I mean, I think, Sandeepji, you're well aware that Nepal actually has, in addition to this track 2, we have a track 3, which is the off-grid electrification. And Nepal, probably among many countries, stands out in terms of having about 10% of the population at the moment electrified by mini-grids, by solar home systems, and all these other technologies. And clearly there's much more to be done. But to have 3,000 mini-grids in the country already, I mean, that too powered by microhydro, but not every district has those microhydro resources. I think one thing you'll be interested to know is that at the Alternative Energy Promotion Center, they are concerned that we are running out of microhydro sites because the demand for new microhydro has actually been declining over the last few years. So what this is pointing to is we really have pushed the boundary on that significantly more than we have on the mini hydro, small hydro, middle hydro. So far nobody's heard of, the number of sites declining or, more and more licenses are being given out. So I think there's clearly room for solar mini grids, and you and I have talked about that, and solar home systems. I mean, there is a large population out there, even in the places where you have the hydro in all these remote districts. It's at 1 or 2 locations. With the geography of Nepal, a huge percentage of those districts, for them, the main opportunity is still with an off-grid solution. So yeah, I'm happy with the developments we've made in that. I think there, the public-private partnership has been significantly stronger compared to what's been happening here, where it was all public and now significantly private, and we haven't hit that optimal point where the public and private are really working with each other in a self-helping, self-supportive way. Thanks.
Kazi, thank you very much for your excellent presentation, but I also would like to thank you for telling us that load shedding is finally on the way out after 18 months. Thank you very much. Yeah. Having said that, see, the impression that I get is that the hydropower sector in Nepal is evolving despite the government. See, so if the government were to be more accountable, more proactive, a lot more could have happened. Therefore, the question that I'm asking you is that, is there some way for the power sector to generate pressures on the political system of the country so that the political system becomes more responsive, not only to the power sector, but also other sectors of development in the country? Since you are stationed in Washington, the think tank of the world, I think this is one of the tasks that you could take home. Thank you.
Thank you, Bihariji. I mean, if the government hadn't played a clear role in forcing the NEA to sign those PPAs, many of these projects would not have happened. So I know government has played a role, but it's been in a very ad hoc way, not in a structured way. And I think the place where the efficiency has been missing is in doing the fundamental things around planning basins, is in having a regulator. At the moment you have NEA signs our PPAs, but there is no regulator to arbitrate between the IPP and the NEA as equals. Everybody's at the mercy of NEA. So government really has to play that role of being an arbiter between these two parties. Otherwise, the ambitions you see of these IPPs, the big projects they want to do, versus what they are actually able to do, that gap is increasing by the day. So I think all of us are extremely impatient that the governance in this country hasn't settled. We don't have a constitution, that we don't have a well-functioning local governments as well as central government. These are, every day the cost of that is increasing for the hydro sector. It is remarkable how much has been achieved, as you said, in the absence of really active government role here. But there's a limit to how far that can go. And I think every day we lose when that doesn't catch up. And I think there is quickly a ceiling which many people are going to be hitting with that. So I think it's really not one or the other. I think we really need for government to step in and become active. But this is not just in hydro. It's in every sector across. And but it goes both ways. These are these situations where these are necessary but insufficient types of situations. The government is necessary but insufficient to bring up a huge sector like this. The private sector equally is necessary but unable to do the rest of the regulatory side of things. I think the two together complement each other well, where both those parts could be well dovetailed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bikash, for your excellent presentation. My name is Shankar Khagi. I work for US and Nepal. So now we see that these big projects are coming on. PDA have been done for 2 big projects at least. And as we stand at this point, and so far we have talked about looking inside within Nepal, our domestic demand and meeting domestic needs. So how do you look at, for the coming days, looking ahead, down the road, as we look at these big projects, exporting power to India and the region. So how do you think, as a strategy for Nepal's hydro, how should we strategize, talking about alternatives? Sandeep ji just talked about solar. How could we have, other alternatives, solar or wind coming in, and what are the best alternatives? Do you think the situation we are now is the best, as you term this organic growth? So how do you see this going forward, the alternatives? How do we treat our hydro as a strategic asset?
Well, thank you. This is slightly beyond the scope of what I have been presenting, but since you've asked, I'm a believer, like many people here, that the best use of Nepal's hydro and #1 priority should be for Nepal, and we have that hydro should really be used to generate income, to support economic sectors, to make us competitive in the region. So I think ideally we should use the hydro to build industries here. Several sectors I think could be attracted to Nepal if we did have reliable power. Everybody is, at this point, this is almost such a hypothetical discussion, what could we do with more power? So it's hard to get to actual things. But I think people have talked about the IT sector. We could be a hub for so many things. So many industries along our border would be on the Nepal side if we had more reliable power. Nepal is a service sector, servicing the growing India and the growing Chinese tourism market. All of those, there's a huge amount of things we could be doing with power here. However, I do know that because hydropower is a renewable resource, that selling power to India today doesn't mean that it's gone forever. It's not like we are extracting coal, or we're extracting natural gas, or extracting oil and selling it, and then it is gone forever. I often take the example of the Andikola project in Sangja. You know, when Andikola, that 5.1 megawatt project was developed, that area around Sangja, you know, could only use about 200 kilowatts, and everything else was sold in Butwal through a 66 kV line. It took less than 20 years before not only is that full 5 megawatts now consumed within Sangja, but on that same line they import power now. If that line to Butwal had never been built, that 5 megawatt project would not have been feasible. It would have been a 200 kilowatt project. You know, it got built really to sell to Butwal, through Butwal to the whole country. And now, you know, so in a sense, developing a hydro bigger than the immediate needs in that area is not necessarily a bad thing. And if that requires selling initially to India, I don't have a problem with it. But, you know, I mean, Nepal's population, 30 million going to 40 million, we look at, you know, 1 kilowatt each per person per capita, which is, you know, modest, it's not huge. And we need most of those 40,000 megawatts for ourselves. You know, it's not, so, but I think initially we don't have enough investment in this country to develop all that hydro just for the Nepali market. So I'm not against those projects being designed in such a way if that brings in financing for those to be developed. The terms have to be such that, you know, we get those benefits clearly stated, that it reverts back to Nepal, that even right now first priority should be to meet the needs here. But as I'm pointing out, I think we are on our way to seeing load shedding addressed through smaller projects here. Some of the larger projects, I think, allow us to take that next step to be doing something a lot more substantial. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing for these projects to be being developed, but it has to be done carefully. And the issue is, those PDAs are signed, but this is just a first step. I mean, the issues around displacement of people, local concerns, local costs, many of those things start after this point. And these are not simple problems. These are challenges throughout the world. There's one more point, since you know, you're with USAID. I'm thinking that as donors support these large export projects, I think it has to be very clearly communicated within the country, you know, how these projects are first going to meet the needs here. Because I think politically it will not be palatable to be making large projects for export when people cannot see the end of the tunnel here. So I think that's something that really has to be clearly, I think, taken into account. Thanks.
Kieran Hansen from Untitled Chapter in the UK, and better? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Kieran Hansen from Hydroplan in the UK and Sanima here in Nepal. I agree with your drawing some parallels with the UK. I agree that you need an independent arbiter, and ideally an alternative to NEA. That's just a statement. I also applaud the efforts of the independent power producers in Nepal, and they have grown so much. Looking to the future, as you did 20 years ago, would you consider the argument that the private sector will continue to grow such that it could fill the gap completely and perhaps even fund some of the bigger projects that you've been talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think the limit is going to be the private sector. I don't think will do projects where it cannot monetize some of the benefits. So a project with irrigation benefits, or a project that regulates water flow, you know, a big reservoir that requires lots of compensation for local people. I don't think those are things that the private sector, unless there's a clever way to monetize those and turn that into a revenue stream. But otherwise, I mean, I do think very much that the trend is that the private sector can build some pretty large projects. I don't see any challenges there. And, you know, what concerns me is the private sector ambitions right now are hitting I don't know if it's a glass ceiling or what type of ceiling this is, but it's a bureaucratic ceiling where NEA is the only market. NEA, for some good reasons and some spurious, kinds of reasons, is not, and also is not in a position really to take these types of risks. So I think government really, fundamentally, as Biharji was saying, needs to step in and make it clear to NEA what its risks and responsibilities are, and also make it clear how the risks to the private sector in selling to this very limited market are going to be overcome. So I'm a big supporter of the power trade agreement with India, because I think at this point Nepal needs that power trade agreement more than India does. And mainly I'm looking at it from the perspective of ambitious IPPs which have nowhere to go. And like any sector, if you don't give room for growth, those resources, that expertise will flow somewhere else. So I think if for nothing else but to give that hope and that opening to the fast-growing IPP sector here, I think that both that PTA route has to be exploited, as well as complementary investments here linked with reservoirs and other ways that the government can build the large projects to balance out the seasonal variations of the run-of-river projects.
We'll take the last question now. Last lady there.
My name is Anahita. I'm a journalist. My question is rather different from most of which have gone before. I would like to go back to the beginning of your presentation. You talked about the concept of democracy and also civic mobilization, which had resulted in the scrapping of Arun III. I'm wondering how you see whether those tools have been able to influence other initiatives which are supported by donors, or where certain interest groups are promoting a single solution projects, whether that has actually happened. One example you gave where it has not happened is in water supply. But whether those tools of democratic mobilization have been used, and if so, how successfully?
Thank you, Anita. I'm struggling right now to come up with another good example in terms of an exact parallel. But I know there are several sectors, after democracy, where, the pluralistic approach has very strongly been allowed by the advent of democracy. I think, Biharji is right here. Community forestry, I think, is one of those sectors where soon after democracy, the community forest groups took a very strong stand in terms of their ownership of those forests and established that, that control was not going to revert back to the DFOs again. I think that was one of those examples. I don't have any other immediate examples of that nature, but I think that example is out there. I think where the water system couldn't work in that particular way, which is too bad. But several sectors opened up. The airline sector opened up in a big way without activism. I think, so some sectors did naturally open up after democracy, but others didn't. And the electricity one, telecom opened up, with private companies being allowed in. So several sectors did open up by themselves just because of international trends. I think the ones that didn't are the power sector and, some of these other infrastructure, roads and some of these other types of things. But it's been different across the board. Sorry, I don't have a more succinct response.
Thank you, Bikash, and thank you for the participants asking very interesting, lively questions. And we hope that the discussion will be carried on outside as well as in coming days. Thank you, Bikash, and let us thank him for the lecture.